In the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, many African Americans tried to enlist and take up President Lincoln's request of 75,000 volunteers to help suppress the Southern insurrection. Upon arriving at the enlistment offices, virtually all black people were denied to join the Union military. A quote from Frederick Douglass sums up the white Northern opinion at the time. He said, "Colored men were good enough to fight under Washington. They are not good enough to fight under McClellan. They were good enough to fight under Andrew Jackson. They are not good enough to fight under General Halleck. They were good enough to help win American independence, but they are not good enough to help preserve that independence against treason and rebellion. They were good enough to defend New Orleans, but not good enough to defend our poor, beleaguered capital." The reason the recruiters were allowed to do this was due to the Militia Act of 1792, which forbid any non-white men from joining the militia or army. It wasn't until the summer of 1862 that the Second Confiscation and Militia Act was passed, which overrode the first Militia Act and allowed African Americans into military service. Despite the victory for African Americans, the implementation of this law was slow and encountered resistance. Many African Americans who joined the military were put in auxiliary roles such as laborers and medics, rather than as soldiers. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, finally allowed African Americans to join the military as soldiers and sailors, with Lincoln expressly stating that African Americans will be accepted as soldiers and sailors into the Union military. Because of this, a total of 179,000 African Americans joined the U.S. military throughout the rest of the war, making up 10% of the U.S. military at the time. This service came at a heavy cost to the African American community, with a total of 40,000 African Americans losing their lives during the war, with 30,000 dying from disease and 10,000 dying from other causes, including combat. Black soldiers fought in segregated units commanded by white officers. They initially received a meager $10 per month, with a fee of $3 for clothing. For reference, a typical white soldier received $13 per month, with no fee for clothing. One of the most infamous battles that African American soldiers participated in was the Second Battle of Fort Wagner on July 18, 1863. The African American 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, which was commanded by their abolitionist officer Robert Shaw, was selected to be the first to storm the fort. After fierce close-quarters fighting, Robert Shaw was killed, and the 54th Regiment was repulsed from the fort. The remaining Union regiments retreated, and the assault was totally abandoned. This battle calls into question why the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment was tasked with being the spearhead of the assault, despite having very little combat experience and had only been formed a couple months prior. In May of 1863, the Confederate Congress passed a resolution stating that all black people taken in arms would be handed over to the state in which they were captured. This effectively meant that captured black soldiers would be sold into slavery. On top of this, black people attempting to surrender were sometimes executed on the spot. A famous example was the massacre of Fort Pillow on April 12, 1864. After the fort was overrun by the Confederates, the majority of the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery surrendered. They were subsequently shot, leading to 300 African American deaths, some of which may have been women and children. One Confederate sergeant wrote in his diary about the killing, saying, quote, "The slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall on their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy. But they were ordered to their feet and then shot down." One Confederate newspaper wrote, "Thus the whites received quarter, but the Negroes were shown no mercy." Lewis Douglass was born on October 9, 1840, to famous abolitionist and writer Frederick Douglass in New Bedford, Massachusetts. When he was 23, he joined the 54th Volunteer Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, in early 1863. He was granted the rank of sergeant major and participated in the famous Second Battle of Fort Wagner, where he was injured. Despite being severely injured, Lewis never gave up fighting and continued to serve in the 54th Infantry Regiment throughout the rest of the war. In a letter written to his beloved Amelia, Lewis wrote of his spirit for the abolitionist cause, saying, quote, "Think of me as aiding in the glorious work of bursting loose those chains which keeps the husbands, wives, children, lovers, and friends of millions asunder, as aiding to the overthrow of a system, the cruelty, tyranny, and crime of which degrades millions of human beings to a level scarcely on a footing with the brutes." Alexander Augusta was born to free black parents on March 9, 1825, in Norfolk, Virginia. During his childhood, Augusta was taught to read and write despite it being illegal in the state of Virginia. He developed a dream of one day becoming a doctor. Augusta eventually married his lifelong partner, Mary Burgoyne, and the couple moved to Toronto, Canada, where Augusta was able to pursue his bachelor's degree in medicine. He even started his own practice in Toronto and was later appointed as the head of the Toronto City Hospital. When Augusta heard news of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, he felt a duty to support African American units who were suffering from disease and infections at a higher rate than white units. After a long battle of writing back and forth to the U.S. Medical Board, Augusta was finally allowed into the 7th U.S. Colored Infantry on April 14, 1863, at the age of 38. Dr. Augusta was stationed across the border states and Washington, D.C., including Camp Stanton and a newly made hospital for African Americans located at Camp Barker in D.C. At Camp Barker, Dr. Augusta was assigned as the head of the hospital, and remarkably, he became the first African American person to be the head of a hospital in U.S. history. One day, as Dr. Augusta was being transferred out of Camp Barker, he attempted to board a streetcar in the pouring rain. He was told by the conductor that he had to sit on the outside section of the car, as the inside section was reserved for whites only. In the midst of the storming rain, Dr. Augusta refused. He was then kicked out of the streetcar. Aggravated by this racist encounter, Dr. Augusta wrote to the U.S. government describing what happened. Remarkably, a senator named Charles Sumner received his letter and advocated for a law to make streetcar discrimination in D.C. illegal. Sumner succeeded, and in March 1865, legislation was passed to make streetcar discrimination illegal in D.C. By the end of the war, Dr. Augusta served under the Medical Division of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, where he assisted former slaves and poor whites in the South with food, education, medical care, and more. In 1869, Augusta was hired to be a professor at the newly created Howard University, where he became the first African American medical professor in U.S. history. Augusta died at the age of 65 in Washington, D.C. He remains the highest ranked African American veteran to serve in the Civil War. Harriet Tubman was born around 1820 in Dorchester County, Maryland, to enslaved parents. Harriet grew up with abundant violence and fear in her house. She was lashed and beaten frequently by her enslavers. At one particular moment in 1832, when out to go get supplies for her enslaver, she encountered an enslaved black man in the fields who had left his plantation. The plantation overseer was trying to catch him and yelled at Tubman to help him. When Tubman refused to do so, the overseer was furious and grabbed a 2-pound weight and threw it at his slave. He missed and struck Tubman in the head. This event caused lifelong headaches, seizures, and narcoleptic episodes for Tubman. During these episodes, she sometimes described having vivid dreams and visions that she believed were a sign from God. She said God spoke directly to her soul during these moments. Harriet eventually escaped with her brothers in 1849, but her brothers forced her back to the plantation as they had second thoughts. They worried because the punishment for escaping slavery and being caught could be being sold into the Deep South, which had even worse conditions than the plantation they were on in Maryland. After having the same prophetic vision of freedom night after night, Tubman decided to set off on her own and escape the plantation in Maryland. She hid during the day and followed the North Star at night. She encountered free black dock workers working at the Delaware Canal, and they helped smuggle her through Delaware via the Underground Railroad. She ended up in the free state of Pennsylvania. Tubman subsequently made many rescue missions using the Underground Railroad, saving her parents, nieces, nephews, and countless other enslaved African Americans. At the outbreak of war, Tubman volunteered as a nurse and served to help survivors of the Fort Wagner assault. After the battle, she was assigned to a hospital in Virginia specializing in dysentery and the African American units. While dysentery was ravaging the African American units, Tubman developed her own home remedy from local roots and herbs, which seemed to quell the outbreak. Even after the war, Tubman continued to help injured and sick African American veterans and advocated for more sanitary conditions. Tubman remained a staunch supporter of African American rights and women's rights for the rest of her life until she died at the age of 91 in 1913. Despite fighting and dying for the U.S. government and the end of slavery, African Americans did not receive the recognition they deserved after the war. Only 27 Medals of Honor out of the 1,523 Civil War Medals of Honor were given to African Americans. Some of these recipients had to wait decades after the war to receive their medals. Survivor and hero of the Fort Wagner assault, Sergeant William Carney, who bravely held the American flag during the assault, had to wait 35 years after the end of the Civil War to receive his Medal of Honor. The federal pension system, established in 1862, theoretically allowed black veterans to receive pensions and disability support after the war in the same way as white veterans. But black veterans rarely qualified for this pension. This was partially because black troops were less likely to be hospitalized during the war, which left them without any medical records to prove their injury. All of this culminated in a higher mortality rate for black veterans after the war, likely from their injuries. One statistic shows that 45% of white veterans lived until 1900 compared to just 29% of black veterans. One of the first major monuments built to honor black veterans was built decades after the Civil War in Massachusetts in 1896. It honors Robert Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Across the South, it took until the 21st century for monuments dedicated to black veterans to be built. One of the first being in Vicksburg, Mississippi, honoring black veterans who fought in the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. Another one was built more recently in 2021 in Franklin, Tennessee, challenging a Confederate monument across from it. Despite the recognition starting to be made more recently, more is needed to recognize the essential role African Americans played during the Civil War. Their sacrifices destroyed the evil institution of slavery and saved the fractured and desperate Union from annihilation.